about the PGCs, primordial germ cells? Many people think they're just passengers. They just happen to migrate through tissue. We don't think that's true at all. We think that when they enter, they're already networked. They've got their own gene activity going. They respond to outside tissues. We published a paper just recently in Molecular where all the detail is given. And ZFY and ZFX are expressed in the PGCs at this time and as they enter the genital ridge. But when they enter the genital ridge, SRY, which was thought to be the primary sex determinant gene, is expressed in Sertoli cells. Sertoli cells. And some people believe that Sertoli cells are the primary sexual differentiator. I can't see a cell like a Sertoli cell taking the functions of germline, of all the sex determinant mechanisms that we know, of the inheritance or inherent itself. A Sertoli cell? Never. I could never accept it on first principles. And PGCs coordinate with the coelom epithelium and meet it in the fruit as they enter the genital fruit. So what we're proposing to you is germline starts early, and embryo quality starts in the PGCs. I am talking here about what we face in IVF, as I'll show you later, when we come to what we do in our laboratories. Let me follow the germline very briefly. This is the Reti system. This is the work of Wenzel and Odendahl in 1985. And this is how we visualize the Reti system. I don't want to spend long on this. Here is the Reti tubules. We think these Reti tubules follow the germline network, to put it briefly. And follicular genesis starts when follicles snap off the end or break off the end. There's a little clump breaking off. And you get little bits of tissue breaking off there. This is what I was asking Geraldine. Geraldine can do this in her work now, you see. She can solve these problems. And you find here the little bunches of cells together. So you get a small group of linked cells. And sometimes we see what we think are nurse cells in these early gonads, in these early germ cells at this stage. They seem to be linked as groups of cells like the Drosophila nurse cells. You also see nuage. Nuage is the classic description of tissue contains mitochondria and ribosomes and is known to be germplasm in other species. So here we have expressing germ cells. We have a system. This Reti system is the same as in the seminiferous tubules. So we can have a timing of these systems based on how the Reti tubules control the PGCs and whether the early ones are there and the later ones are operated from back here. This is our production line hypothesis dominated by the egg. It is the egg that dominates those. So let me go to the egg itself. Now we believe that the primordial germ cell forms an oligonium and an oocyte, and it dominates the follicle. It must dominate the follicle. And the model is Drosophila. And the amount of knowledge in Drosophila is unbelievable. Here's a Drosophila egg after it's developed and it's established a polarity very early on. And this polarity at this end, you get bicoid, the gene bicoid mRNA goes there, nanos mRNA goes there, and there are many others besides this. But essentially a polarity in the egg, and the polarity of the egg determines the polarity of the follicle. Here's the ventral signal, there's a dorsal signal, there's the anterior and posterior of the egg, and also the follicle. So you've got two things in the Drosophila egg. First, the synthesis of mRNAs and maybe proteins, primary mRNAs and proteins, and the total domination of the follicle. Absolutely. And he does it like this. So this little cartoon. Here is the Drosophila oocyte in a cartoon. These genes, swallow and gherkin, send a message to that cell. They'll say to it, put bicoid mRNA there. And that cell does it. That cell does it. And at this end they say, Stauffer says to that cell, put nanos and Oscar there. And that cell does it. The egg sends a message, and the granular cells with their self-respond. And again go to Jonathan. You remember his picture on his lectin stat 3? This happens in the human egg much later on, because the granular cells put in the protein, in his case, into the egg, in the Bourn restoration. Moreover, the egg sends a microtubule to every one of these cells. One microtubule to every one of these cells. And that microtubule ends at one spindle pole in the nurse cell. At one spindle pole.
Okay. Well, it's just great to see so many people here for this event. On behalf of our master, Professor Sharon Peacock, who is in the audience, and all here at Churchill College and the Archive Centre, welcome to this symposium in honour of former fellow Professor Sir Robert Edwards, known to all as Bob. This is the final event in a day of events to mark the centenary of his birth. And I know that many of you have come here from the earlier presentations run by the Loke Centre. I'm Alan Packwood, the Director of the Archive Centre. My job this evening is the easy one. It's just the housekeeping notices. So now is the moment to make sure your mobile phones are on silent. We are recording this evening's proceedings, so if you don't want to be on film, we suggest you move to the back. We're not planning a fire alarm test, so if the alarms sound, we all need to make our way outside and to gather by the Hepworth sculpture and hope it's not raining. On a more cheery note, you're all invited to drinks afterwards. Though for those of you who are dining, timing is likely to be extremely tight and you'll be gonged up to the dining room from the drinks in the buttery for a 7:30 start. If you haven't seen it already, there is a wonderful display outside in the foyer of the work of Bob Edwards, Patrick Steptoe, Jean Purdy and others, which has been assembled from Bob's papers, which are held here in the Archive Centre. And that display was put together by my colleague Madeline Evans, who, if you haven't met her, you will see her with the roving mic during this session. And it's fair to say, I think, that without Madeline, tonight wouldn't have happened. But without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our panel chair. We couldn't have hoped for a better moderator for this evening. Roger Highfield is the Science Director of the Science Museum Group, where he worked on the very relevant exhibition IVF, 6 Million Babies Later. He's a visiting professor at Oxford and UCL, former science editor at the Daily Telegraph, and a prolific writer on science. His website describes him as 80% executive at the Science Museum Group and as 20% author, journalist and broadcaster. Well, tonight he's 100% chair. Roger.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you. Well, it's a huge honour to welcome you all to this centenary celebration of Professor Sir Robert Edwards. And of course, it's really appropriate. It's here at Churchill College, Cambridge, a place that was really deeply connected to his legacy. The event's been made possible thanks to the Churchill Archive Centre, the Edwards family, the Loke Centre for Trophoblast Research and Cambridge Reproduction, and we're very grateful for that support. I don't need to tell anyone who knew Bob Edwards, he is a visionary. Alongside Patrick Steptoe and his assistant and technician Jean Purdy, he laid the foundation for in vitro fertilization, a technique that's since brought joy to millions of families. His determination to help those struggling with infertility led to the birth of Louise Brown in 1978, who's just over there. Phenomenal. And Louise's birth changed science and society and medicine forever. Now, Bob's journey was not easy. He faced very fierce opposition in the early days. He was denied funding. I'm on the Medical Research Council. I'm sorry, Bob, okay. And he endured public criticism too. And the breakthrough provoked very deep ethical debate, leading eventually to the Warnock Report of '84 and the establishment of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. And this is regulatory machinery that's still in existence today. Yet Bob pushed on, driven by compassion and scientific curiosity. Now, his work not only revolutionized fertility treatment, but it also opened the doors to stem cell research, to genetic screening and embryo science, and these fields are very much alive and well today. In my own writing, including books co-authored with Ian Wilmot and Magda Zernicka-Gertz, I've explored how the earliest moments of human development are shaped by biology, chance, and choice. And much of that inquiry rests on the shoulders of Edwards and his collaborators. As mentioned, at the Science Museum, we marked Louise's 40th birthday with an exhibition, a major celebration, and it was an incredible reminder of how far we've come and how much we owe to Bob's courage and persistence. So tonight, we're going to hear from those who knew Bob personally, who worked alongside him, and were directly impacted by his work, from his early research to the founding of Bourn Hall Clinic, and from the birth of Louise to his Nobel Prize in 2010. Bob Edwards' story is one of scientific brilliance, resilience, and the enduring power of collaboration between scientists, clinicians, and patients. So to set the stage, let's begin by looking at the world before Louise's birth, through the eyes of those who knew Bob in his formative years, with glimpses from the archives that captured the spirit of those early struggles. Bob briefly served in the British Army during World War II, then studied animal genetics at the University of Edinburgh, focusing on mouse and human embryo research. Then at Cambridge, he was at the physiological laboratory and later became professor of human reproduction in 1985. So we're going to begin with those formative years, his early research, the challenges he faced, and we're very fortunate to hear from Sir Richard Gardner, who worked closely with Bob during his academic career, and Dr. Jenny Joy, who brings, of course, a very unique perspective as both his daughter and also the initial custodian of Bob's archive prior to its deposit in the Archive Centre. So let's begin with Jenny and then go on to Richard, and we'll have questions afterwards. And if anyone goes on, Richard has kindly lent me his false teeth, which will start chattering if things get out of control. But first of all, let's go over to Jenny. Over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Well, I'm going to start with a very different presentation, and it's going to be a summary of how my parents got together, and then move on to expanding the more unknown role of my mother as a scientist throughout her life. My father was born in Batley, North Yorkshire, in 1925. His father, Samuel, on the left, had escaped the family trade of coal mining by enlisting in the army at the beginning of World War I. Although Samuel survived the war, it left him permanently disabled, and he struggled to find work. His mother, Margaret, on the right, was the daughter of a Manchester bricklayer who left school to work in a local cotton mill. They married shortly after the war and moved to Batley for Samuel to find work. As a young boy, my father grew up in a council house in Gorton, Manchester. Margaret was absolutely determined that her boys should get a good education, as this would give them many more opportunities in life than their father. This meant that they all passed the 11+ exam, which meant they could attend the Manchester Central High School for Boys. And this, can I have the next slide, please? And going there set them all on the path to be able to access higher education. To cut a long story short, my father eventually arrived in Edinburgh with an ordinary degree from Bangor to study for a 1-year diploma in genetics. He then moved on to a PhD. My mother had gone to Edinburgh for her first degree, got a first-class honours degree, and then undertook a PhD at the Institute of Animal Genetics. And it was here they met and became friendly. My mother came from a well-known Cambridge scientific family, and while they were not incredibly wealthy, she'd had a very different upbringing to that of my father. Initially, their differences made him reluctant to pursue a relationship with her, as he felt he was marrying above his station in life. However, collaboration between them in their research drew them closer, and there is no doubt that she also encouraged him to have a much better work-life balance. She always said that you only had to look at the differences in thickness of their PhD thesis, i.e. hers was much thinner and much less work. I got Madeline at the Archive Centre to fact-check this. My father's is 4 centimetres, and my mother's is 1 centimetre. So I love this photo of them when they were getting married, looking so happy. But before he could marry her, he had to agree in writing that she was never going to iron his shirts once they got married. So he always had to have nylon ones, and I do remember that. She also insisted that they spent all their savings on a decent honeymoon in Venice, something that he was very reluctant to do. But she won this argument, and probably many others. After all, they were equally as strong-willed as each other. So I'm now going to move on to my mother as a scientist. My sister Caroline found her rabbit-keeping records when she was age 15 at Duck End Farm when she was sorting out the papers. Ruth bred them to sell at a local meat market for meat at the time of rationing in 1945 when meat was scarce. So she was clearly not at all squeamish. I've already talked about how they came together in Edinburgh, but their collaborative work in Edinburgh in the early days resulted in a series of key papers which describe methods that are still important today, particularly those in relation to superovulation. Once Ruth had finished her PhD, they went to Caltech in California, where Bob was offered a year's work. Although Ruth did not have a grant, she still worked tirelessly in the labs to set up a comparison of the culture conditions for mouse embryos, which was similar to later work carried out on human embryos. And we have photos of at least 5 trips they made away during their time in Caltech. So clearly they followed Ruth's philosophy here of both working and playing hard. While she had her time out to have 5 children, there is no doubt that she was still very active in the developing science of IVF by both helping to produce papers and being kept up to date in what was going on by Bob, both verbally and in letters. On this slide is an example of a letter Bob wrote to her in 1965 when he was working at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. And you can read this and other letters from him to her in the Archive Centre. Once her children were old enough for her to return to work, Ruth became a member of the Marshall Lab team. During that period, she still authored or co-authored many more papers, including some influential work in collaboration with Bob and Patrick in 1978. My parents also moved to the farm in 1978, at a time when they clearly had a lot else going on. My mother soon took over the running of it, as my father quickly tired of keeping cattle. He frequently said that he had traded cattle for people. In contrast, she absolutely loved keeping cattle, a passion she could also share with one of her sisters who kept cattle in the Cotswolds. From papers we found, my mother clearly did a huge amount of research about Angora goats and what lines to use before starting a herd. She bought an imported kid called Adrienne from New Zealand to use for IVF, and she kept the cost to a minimum by using ordinary cheap goats for the IVF embryos, and within a year, her first IVF kids were born, and those are them on the right. Within a few years, her Crafts Hill Angora herd had grown considerably, and she was registering all the kids with the British Angora Goat Society. The goat on the left was a buck she bred called Billy, who was huge, quite a character, and lasted for many years, which was maybe unfortunate because he did smell terrible in winter. Her crafty Angoras started to win prizes in the Norfolk and Suffolk agricultural shows, and she won several championships in 1994. She was incredibly proud of this. She entered a couple of bucks for the British Angora Goat Society recommended list and was very angry when only one of them qualified for inclusion. Therefore, she criticised their selection criteria as hugely unscientific. In the audience tonight is a lady called Angela, who helped my mother with the livery yard and all aspects of running the farm from shortly after they moved in until well after she died. So thank you very much, Angela.
Where is Angela? Angela, wait. We talked a bit from IVF, but I thought that was important.
Yes.
Back to you.
Yes, yes. So, next slide. My mother also enjoyed wildlife and conservation. She created a wildflower area on the pond field they created and started moth trapping. And these are photos of moths she took herself. Within a few years, she was giving advice to Cambridge University about management in the local Madingley Woods. My father could never have achieved all he did without my mother. To Dad, she was a tower of strength, his intellectual equal, an amazing mother and grandmother, and by far the most influential person in his life. She was also his scientific companion for over 50 years. Thank you.
Lovely. Now over to the owner of these teeth, Richard.
I chose to read physiology in my final year as an undergraduate in Cambridge, and I was the only non-medic among that bunch that year. I had ambitions to do research if I got a good enough degree, but the department was very skewed in its research interests, so it was almost inevitable that my degree was good enough, I'd end up doing biophysics or neurophysiology. But late in the year, there was a course on reproduction, largely a lecture and practical course, largely given by Bob. And I have to say that I and Martin Johnson, who was a colleague and a lifelong friend, were both completely captivated by Bob's enthusiastic style of lecturing and the extraordinary depth and breadth of his knowledge. We also found him to be a great egalitarian, and in discussions, in practicals, we were treated like equals rather than totally green undergraduates, and we were actually on one occasion shown one of his precious oocytes. That was in 1966. So both of us decided that if we got the support to enable us to do so, we'd become Bob's first research students, and that was achieved. So in October 1996, we joined the Marshall Lab, which was right at the top of physiology, and at its entrance, it had a notice board with a hook and a whistle on a length of string. And the instructions were, in case of fire, either shout fire or blow short blasts on the whistle. This was an extreme act of altruism because there's absolutely no fire escape from that level, and I noticed today it subsequently has been installed. We both found Bob's lecturing and supervising style very much to our taste. There's a whole range of ways in which supervisors run PhDs. Not a few of them have their own pet projects that they'd like someone to carry out but don't want to dirty their own hands with. So research students are told you choose project A, B, C or D, and then they are monitored very rigorously at regular intervals to provide reports and updates. This wasn't Bob's style. He said to us, go away for a couple of months, do very extensive and intensive reading to try and come up with a project that would fire you with enthusiasm, and at the same time learn basic techniques of mouse embryology. So after the month or two of this intensive reading, we went back to Bob, and then he would discuss with us whether our proposal was technically feasible, original, and provide enough material to generate a thesis. He never hung over us or leaned over our shoulders, but he was always available, particularly before 69 when the trips to Oldham started. And very often we'd repair, the three of us, to the Fountain pub for a lunch of pernicious cheese and onion rolls and a pint or two of tartan bitter. So that was the way he operated. And my project was to take apart and study the individual tissues and then reassemble and transplant cells between the blastocyst stage, that's the immediate pre-implantation stage of mouse development, and it required a considerable investment of my time and energy because unlike the rabbit blastocyst that some of you heard of earlier, the mouse blastocyst is about a tenth of a millimeter in diameter. So it required development of fairly sophisticated techniques. But for Bob, the period between 1966 and 68 was a one of complete stasis so far as progress in IVF was concerned. But ever mentally active and energetic, he then approached me with concern about possible alternatives to amniocentesis and abortion to deal with the problem of serious genetic disease, risk of inheritance of serious genetic disease. And at that time, this was long before you could manipulate genes and determine their normal from mutant counterparts. The best we could do is to concentrate on the X chromosome. Now, many of you will know that some pretty horrendous diseases are X chromosome linked, like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, certain hemophilias and others. So the idea was a sort of proof of principle to adopt the rabbit blastocyst immediate pre-implantation stage to actually biopsy it and then to sex the biopsy and transfer the embryos according to our determined sex. So Bob recovered the embryos, I did the microsurgery, and then he did the transfer. And it was very difficult with this very expanded blastocyst because it only functions, there's an outer non-living envelope called the zona, and then there's the trophectoderm, and it can only implant if both are intact. In other words, it's expanded, rather like an inner tube within a tire. And it took me a long time to get the first 6 beautiful blastocysts biopsied, typed, and recover in culture. I handed them to Bob to transfer, and he turned round with a sickly grin on his face and 6 little pearls hanging on the lapel of his lab coat. Martin said I fumed out of the lab without saying a word, but everything worked out in the end, and we managed to do that. He was also, as an egalitarian, he had many senior scientific contacts that used to visit the lab, and he always took immense trouble to introduce us humble research students and give us an opportunity to explain the sort of research we did. And the most notable of these people was the late Francis Crick of DNA fame, who in the 60s had decided the classical phase of molecular genetics was over. They'd determined that DNA was the genetic material. They had cracked the code, and he was thinking of moving on either to the brain or to the embryo. And we had a lunch at the Fountain pub where he and a colleague discussed with Bob the various options. But all wasn't terribly easy in the Marshall lab. We got the distinct impression that us inhabitants up there in this lofty region were part of a lunatic fringe group. if you went down to the mechanical workshop, the very gruff head of it would say to you, physiology or Marshall. If it was physiology, the job would be done that day or that week. If it was Marshall, oh dear, you'll have to wait for that. But it was the person who suffered most from the general disdain was Bob, because he felt, which was totally out of character of most scientists at the time, that those who were working on subjects that had important social implications had a responsibility to inform the public what they were doing. And this was completely alien at the time, that people would actually determine that it wasn't their responsibility. So, but he took every opportunity of publishing in broadsheet and tabloid newspapers explaining what they were doing. And this backfired in a very severest way, that he was then widely regarded as a scientifically lightweight self-promoter, which was terribly unfair. Martin and I, when we were research students, we were deeply concerned that such a brilliant mind was fixated on the technical problem of achieving fertilization in vitro.
It was your idea, Richard.
Okay, fine, that's right. Yep.
No, well, look, I'm sorry to
No, that's fine.
off there, Richard, but actually I would just love to get a couple of questions for Jenny and Richard before we move on to the next section. And we've got Alan and his team ready. Is anyone itching to ask a question from what we've heard so far? I mean, it's such a rich subject, you know, and I feel a bit guilty stopping Richard in full flow there, but we've also got to end at 7:15 on the dot, so I just wanted to make sure. Let me just ask one question of you, Richard. I'm fascinated by this relationship between people who engage with the media, and I remember with Daily Telegraph, it was always easy to talk to Bob about whatever advances were of the day, and peer group pressure. I think things have changed now, but back then there was a real disdain, wasn't there, for scientists who engaged with the media?
Oh yes, no, it was regarded as beyond the pale to actually feel that it was important to communicate with the public. Yeah.
And Jenny, your mother seems an incredible. It reminds me of all the discussions of Mileva Maric and Einstein and so on. Yes. I mean, how much of a force was she behind his research? Should she have had her name on his key papers?
Well, she had her name on an awful lot of papers.
Right.
So, you know, there were over 36 that she either led or co-authored. So she was there all the time, and she was being kept up to date with him. So she was she was a strong woman, basically, and she had 5 children. She was still producing papers at a time when she had 5 children, no laptop, and she was incredible.
No, incredible. Look, thank you both, Richard and Jenny. Fantastic. So now, in the spirit of keeping things galloping on, let's move to the remarkable events of 1978. The birth of Louise obviously was a seismic moment, not just in science, but in society, and marked the culmination of years of research, risk, and resilience. And Bob, along with Patrick Steptoe, Jean Purdy, Ruth, big team, a lot of patients achieved what many people thought impossible. But this breakthrough wasn't just technical, it was deeply human as well. So we're very honoured to hear tonight from Louise, whose birth changed the world. And we're also going to hear from Emma Barnett, a BBC broadcaster, journalist, and IVF parent who brings a contemporary lens to the legacy of that moment. So let's begin with Louise, then move to Emma, and then we'll take a few questions afterwards. So over to Louise.
Hello everyone. Over the years, I've been asked a lot of very strange and crazy questions by journalists. One memorable one was, do you remember what it was like being in the test tube? Hopefully everyone here knows the answer to that question. I also don't remember anything about the work of Bob Edwards and the team before I was born. But I did hear a few things from my mum and dad. Patrick Steptoe, as a gynecologist, took my mum into his confidence. Bob took time to be friends with my dad. When there was tension as my birth got closer and the pressure of the interest from around the world grew, he would say, "John, let's go down the pub." Bob has always been a part of my life. Bob and Patrick were like extra grandfathers to me. I gradually learned as I grew up what being the test tube baby meant and the role that Bob had played in my birth. I have great memories of going to Bourn Hall and having a big fuss made of me. Bob was a kind and lovely character. The parties at Bourn involved other IVF babies that had been born, and I was made to feel that I was part of a big family. And I still feel that today as I go around the world to IVF events and to meet other people born through IVF. I am convinced that it was not entirely an accident that my mum and dad were from a poor background. Dad was a lorry driver and mum had an ordinary job. They were far from rich, and after they first met, they were sleeping rough in railway carriages. I think Bob wanted IVF to be for everyone, not just for the rich, and that was important to him in his well-known political views. It was Bob that wrote to Mum on December the 9th, 1977, informing her that she was pregnant. Here is the letter which I have deposited in a museum archive. He said, "Please take things quietly. No skiing, climbing, or anything too strenuous, including Christmas shopping." Of course, he knew Mum was never likely to go skiing and climbing and that she would be Christmas shopping. Dad read the letter first. Mum arrived at the house a little later and was carrying lots of bags from her Christmas shopping, which sent Dad into a panic. One of my best memories of Bob was when he came to my wedding. There was a photographer there from OK magazine taking pictures of me. Bob stayed quietly in the background, and we had this picture taken of the two of us together between the wedding and the reception. He wasn't interested in the glory, but it was great to have him there as one of the most important people in my life. Later, when I became pregnant, I made sure that Bob was the first person I told after my parents. He was so pleased to see the legacy of IVF continue into another generation. He also had been delighted when my sister Natalie became pregnant and gave birth at the age of 16. She was the first IVF baby in the world to become pregnant naturally, and it was another milestone and proof that there is nothing unusual about those born through the technique. It is fair to say that Bob was more pleased than Mum and Dad about Natalie. As I got older, I got to know Ruth and Jenny Joy and the whole family, and they have always been a special part of my life. These days, I travel around the world to IVF events and clinics. On almost every trip, there is an older doctor or IVF specialist who comes up to me and mentions that they knew Bob. Tells me how he helped them through their early years or how much they learned from him. This year, I have stood in Athens chatting about Bob and in Mexico chatting about Bob to experts who have made a real difference in their own countries. In the last month, I have talked to embryologists in Croatia and was called upon to open a new IVF clinic in Alicante in Spain. My birth has meant I have travelled to 4 continents. The words hope and joy follow me around the world. 2 very positive words that came from Bob and the team. Like others here, I was not happy that it took so long for Bob to be recognised with the Nobel Prize. It is interesting that now we have a Netflix film and the benefits of seeing how much IVF changed the world, that he is at last getting the recognition he deserves. I'm so pleased to be part of this celebration today and for all of us to take a bit of time to reflect on what an amazing person Bob was. Thank you for inviting me.
That's great. Thank you. That was lovely. And Emma, you've got a very tough act to follow there, indeed. Over to you.
Thanks, Louise. It's lovely to be here to talk to people, not having woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning to present the Today programme, which I normally do. But yes, my life changed, our lives, my husband is here this evening, Jeremy, our lives changed very dramatically because of IVF. We tried for 2 years to have children, and I had always known perhaps something wasn't right with me, and I had suffered with great pain for many years. And in the process of trying to have our first child, or any child, it was discovered I had endometriosis, something I had not been diagnosed with for 20 years. And very quickly after that, it was clear I just couldn't get pregnant. My husband, it was not the problem. He was very pleased to find that out. It was definitely me. So it was good to have some accountability. That's what I do for a living. And there was a incredible nurse in the NHS, very plain speaking, and she just said to me, for God's sake, just have IVF, because we kept trying. And I had signed the papers before Jeremy had come back in the room and asked him to sign them. And he said, shouldn't we talk about this? I said, no, we've just got to do this now. And, you know, I had no idea what I was getting involved with, but there's lots of things you read. I was nervous, but the NHS in its true glory, because there's gore too when it comes to women in particular and pregnancy and birth, if you get that far, but long before that journey, just sent home this box of drugs like a Chinese takeout. It was like sort of bog standard, and this process began in our life. And I say our lives, of course Jeremy did play a role, but it's very singularly you and your doctor as the woman. And if we had only been in this situation, I would think IVF, and I do think IVF, and that's why I'm here this evening, and it's wonderful to be so, would be the most brilliant science in the world. And it still is for what I'm about to say, but it worked, right? You know, it worked first time. And 9 months later, we had the baby we never thought we were going to have. And when he was delivered in London, you know, made on the NHS, delivered on the NHS, I honestly felt, obviously quite scared at this point, but like an Olympian. You know, I felt like I was crossing a line I didn't know we could cross. We'd started to prepare for life without children, and psychologically that takes you to a very different place. And we then dared to be audacious and want a second child. And I'm an only child. My husband's one of 3, and that's when IVF took on a whole other life for me, because it took 6 rounds. And so we got in that ring 6 times. And what's fascinating reflecting on it is a lot of it comes down to hope. And hope is a terrible thing, actually. It's a wonderful thing, but it becomes a tormentor at the same time. And I never thought I'd be someone who had rounds and rounds and rounds of IVF. I thought, we'll try once, it didn't work. And it was such a shock because it had worked the first time, last time. And then the pandemic hit. And I was in the middle of a cycle. I was on air, I used to work at 5 Live at the time, and I was presenting Newsnight. And I just got to finish that cycle. But the very next day, they stopped people through their IVF cycles. And my heart broke into a million pieces for these people. And my producers didn't know I was having IVF. And my next guests that morning, I had a 3-hour mid-morning programme on 5 Live, were couples who were stopped. And they were ploughing their life savings. They'd had their, if they were lucky enough, to free NHS round. And, you know, I didn't talk about myself, but I could feel, there's not often I'm in a situation where I could feel every part of what they were feeling. And my round, I got to the end and it had obviously failed as well. And it became, doing IVF during the pandemic became this very intense experience. My husband was no longer allowed to come. We were using frozen embryos. And so I used to go alone. And just what you said about your relationship with Bob, in the end, I was doing IVF with a 56-year-old Egyptian man called Tariq in an NHS hospital who even changed his hours for me. So by this point, we'd had our free round, just to be clear. I was paying for IVF, but I wanted to stay in the NHS, which lots of people, I tell women all the time, and men, you don't have to go to Harley Street. You don't have to go, it's still expensive, but you can stay in the NHS, and it's far simpler, cheaper. There are no add-ons. What you see is what you get. And I think that's brilliant. But, you know, this wonderful doctor came to work half an hour earlier so we could do IVF before Woman's Hour, where I now was. And we were doing IVF. And one day, you know, everything has to be with the timing. And I'm injecting, like one of the last places I injected before our son, by the way, was before I interviewed Theresa May at Downing Street. And my producer thought I was too nervous and was coming out the toilet. I said, no, I'm just in the middle. You know, I was in the middle of like 8 million things, you know, pulling needle lids off of my mouth by the end of this process. You know, that's the whole of the story. But and the King of Spain was walking down the corridor. It was a whole thing. Anyway, and but you know, I got stuck between floor 11 and floor 12 in Guy's Hospital in London, and the blood test had to happen then, and then I had to be on air at 10 a.m. on Radio 4. And you know, Tariq stood in a well with like a person freeing me from a lift, like. The man and I have eyeballed each other at some interesting times, not least when he's been taking my eggs out of my body for the fertilization. So it's a really intense relationship. And I'm very, you know, and then we went to a whole other level when on the 5th round of IVF, I had a miscarriage. So it worked, you know, and we were over the moon, and we were, you know, and I have to say, I know the statistics, 1 in 4 women, you know, pregnancies end in miscarriage. But I thought, how could it, if you've come this far with IVF, the sort of injustice of that, never mind the grief. And it was a doctor friend of mine who happened to be going through IVF, which also shows the importance of the community around IVF. And we go for a walk and a drink, a stiff drink, 2 nights after my miscarriage. And she said to me, do you not see, because we found out, I should say, that there was something wrong with the baby, there was something genetically wrong, they would never have lived if they hadn't died in the womb. She said, true doctor style, and I love doctors and scientists, all in the facts. She said, this is great that we know that your baby wouldn't have lived. I'm looking at her thinking, I'm not in this space right now. And she's like, because it worked again. So we have proof, Emma, that you're still viable. And I thought, I'm viable. Excellent. And I came home, and my husband, we call her Dr. Katie. We can't call her Katie anymore. And he said, Dr. Katie's got you to go again, hasn't she? And I said, yes. And I just sort of hauled myself up the stairs, and we went this final time. And our daughter was born 9 months later. And honestly, our whole lives have been totally changed by the magic of Bob and his team. And being a parent of children that wouldn't be here, it does augment your parental experience. It augments your your worldview, I should say. And I really have to just say, you know, 1 in 6 people we think are affected globally. That's what the World Health Organization has by infertility. It is a disease. It doesn't matter what the disease was that maybe made you infertile, but an IVF is treatment, an IVF is medicine, and I couldn't not come this evening when I heard of this, and was very happy, very blessed to be invited, because Bob Edwards changed our lives. The entire course of my life, and so many others, is totally and utterly different, and our children don't have a clue, but sadly for them, their mother talks a lot, and they will find out. But it won't be the same big deal as it was with Louise, and that's also an incredible thing. I don't feel there's a taboo or shame about how we made our children with Tariq, and I go see Tariq, and I text him on the birthdays of our children, and Tariq is such a modest man, he would blush enormously to know I'm talking about him now, but he is so thrilled, and he, like many IVF doctors, he's doing it for the joy, and he's doing it for the hope. And every time he got me back in that ring, I just had to say, okay, we'll go again. And that is that. So thank you very much.
Wow. You know, I'm not sure how many IVF children there are on the planet now. It must be 10, 20 million, something like that. It's incredible how much joy has come from this, from Bob's work. We've got time, a few minutes for a few questions for Louise or Emma. And again, there's a roving microphone on hand here. Does anyone want to ask a couple of questions? You're being very shy as an audience. Oh, look, here we are. I've got a question over here. Quick. Hopefully we can warm you up a bit. Gosh.
Thank you so
Fire
much.
away.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Julia. Thanks so much, Louise and Emma. It was really wonderful to hear your stories, and thank you for sharing. I had a question. You know, Emma, you mentioned maybe the stigma, and it's less of a taboo today. Could you perhaps comment on what it would have been like and how you think it's changed, you know, public opinion and things like that? Because I guess in the early days that would have, you know, that would have had an effect.
Yeah.
Also a question to the other speakers if you want to.
It's definitely changed from when I was born. And it's not just the UK, all over the world there's a taboo. Men, women, I mean, a lot of men, I know IVF obviously, men, their sperm counts are affected. And I know that men don't, especially in a lot of foreign countries I've visited, they don't like to admit it. So there's still a lot of taboo towards men, definitely, around the world. But we still, I mean, this is why I do what I do and I go around the world, because there's no shame in it. I was always asked as a teenager growing up, would I have IVF if I needed it? And my answer at 14 years old was, well, yes, of course I would. Luckily, I didn't need it, and I have two boys, naturally. My sister has 5 children, naturally. So just because you're born through this way doesn't mean that you're going to have to use it in the future. But yeah, there is still a lot of taboo out there, and it does need to be addressed.
I have a question over here.
Thank you so much. This is so inspiring. For those of you who knew Bob personally very well, my question is, if Bob were still alive today, still able to be out there giving interviews, doing science, doing research, where do you think he'd be spending his time? What would he be promoting? Would he be pushing on a certain part of the science? I'm so curious what you think.
He would be at physiology now, and having to climb over the gates, which get locked about 8 o'clock at night, to continue his work, because some of the earlier session shows absolutely where Bob would be. With the techniques that have been evolved, I think he would have been in his element and loved it. But the other thing, which I think is really important, and Emma's encapsulated it, is he was entirely devoted to the patient. They were the center of everything he did, both him and Patrick. Patient-centric care should be delivered free of charge at the point of need. So he'd be campaigning as well.
Any more questions? Oh, follow up.
No, separate question.
Separate question, I beg
I'm my
your
own
pardon.
person. I thank you very much for your candor and your stories. It's very interesting. So it seems like, Louise, your parents were like not particularly affluent, but they got access because they were like part of the early days. But then I assume you were saying that, you know, the first round of your NHS was funded, but then afterwards it was self-funded. And we know that IVF is such a postcode lottery. And I mean, you know, personally very frustrated by it that, like, we don't have postcode lotteries for cancer treatment or for any other kind of diseases. And I also agree that infertility is a disease. And I wonder, to the panel and anyone in the room, do you think that there's a chance that it will change how access to IVF, also for queer couples, where there's like, it's much more complicated, like who gets to have IVF and at what age, like how that's going to be, you know, dealt with in the future?
Well, it's really interesting that the NICE have just NICE body that regulates healthcare applications in the UK have just reinforced the benefits of up to 3 cycles of IVF, which should be made available on the NHS. Unfortunately, and I've done many, many NHS tenders, we started working with the NHS in about 84, 85, but it goes to the lowest common denominator. So despite it being made available, the funding for it is very tightly gated by each of the, what used to be the CCGs, which are now the commissioning boards. I can't see it coming, becoming less of a postcode lottery unless it's taken in centrally. And I don't know what's going to happen with NHS England, but they should be ring fencing and providing the funding throughout, rather than it being seen as a Cinderella treatment by the local CCGs, who spend more on paracetamol than they do on IVF, which is scandalous.
By the way, we're not going to go down the Trump paracetamol rabbit hole. Emma, do you want to come in at all on that point about the postcode lottery?
Well, I think, you know, even the thought that you have, if you have one baby from IVF, I say this now looking at it through the political side of it, that should be your lot if you're infertile, is when you look at it in the cold light of day and look at the rules around queer couples, even perhaps women doing it on their own, everything around that, it looks like it's stayed frozen in time. So I think, you know, moving to a place where you see infertility as a disease is really key to try and change that. I also think the lack of joined up thinking from a government, successive governments concerned about the demographic situation is also fascinating, because if you try it, we see if you incentivize women to have children, it doesn't really work because they can't afford a home or their jobs aren't, you know, but if they can't actually have them, you're not going to get any more children, you know, with a partner or without, or in a same-sex relationship. So, but I don't understand who it will fall to. So I often look at issues, having presented Women's Hour for many years, we have a women's minister. Can anyone name her? Okay, they never can. One time it was Theresa May when she had 4 other jobs, I believe. But the point is, often these sorts of issues don't fall in a set brief, and they certainly don't fall at the top of that brief. It will go between education, which is often viewed as a woman's job in politics, through to the women's ministry to represent how women feel, through to perhaps health. I don't think it's got the prioritisation. How it will get that, it doesn't look very promising at the moment.
But thank you so much for this. I think we're gonna now have the last section, and then there will be time for a few more questions for the whole panel as well. But I think now let's move on to the aftermath of Louise's birth. Obviously, Bob Edwards continued to shape the future of reproductive medicine. He co-founded the Bourn Clinic, the world's first IVF clinic, in 1980. Then he co-founded the European Society of Human Reproduction Embryology, or ESRI, in 1984. And he founded the journal Reproductive Biomedicine Online in 2000. So Bob remained a tireless advocate for scientific progress and patient care, and his influence extended into publishing policy and public engagement, including with me. And of course, he was really well ahead of his time in that respect, in engaging a lot around a very ethically tough subject. So to reflect on this later chapter of Bob's life, we're going to hear from Mike Macnamee, who led Bourn Hall, and Fiona Bennett, the former executive editor of the journal Bob founded to advance reproductive biology. So let's start with Mike, then we're going to go to Fiona, and then we'll have the final question. So over to Mike.
You've just given half of my talk. My goodness. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is how turning that research triumph, which was Louise Brown's birth, following on from 20 years of research and a unique collaboration, I believe it's unique, between medicine and science. The equality of their relationship between Bob and Patrick was paramount. It was clear in every interaction they had together. They had so much respect for each other, and they always had each other's backs. And it's true, they brought hope when there was none. If you think about how infertility was treated before the birth of Louise Brown, everybody has a maiden aunt who never got pregnant. It was really a breakthrough. Initially, society was very positive about Louise Brown's birth, but then came the backlash and rejection from all parts of society. Here's a few press clippings, which you can see the Vatican outlaws it. It was a hoax, said the New York Times Post. The Sun came out with banner headlines, as they like to do, ban the test tube baby. And they were almost forced to leave the UK. They had offers to go abroad to America to start and continue their research and develop what was a research triumph into a robust clinical therapy. Steptoe was getting on a bit, so he retired from the NHS. Bob was still working very actively in Cambridge, but as someone said earlier, they were refused funding and space, which were essential for this work to continue. And the only option they had was to open a private clinic. In charged the Daily Mail with the funding to start the clinic, until one of their senior members of staff, wife, who was a Catholic, decided they should pool the funding. So they pooled it after a year. And eventually, they had to find venture capital from a company called 3 Eyes, which were very innovative at the time and very supportive. So it wasn't for want of trying that they were rejected, because they did try everywhere. And Bourn Hall was identified as the site. In 1978, 79 was withdrawal, and 3 Eyes stepped in. Sorry, I missed that. So, Bourn Hall Clinic opened on 28th of September in 1980. And here you can see it was a Grade 2 star listed manor house set in 22 acres of parkland, but it was in need of much restoration. But Bob and Patrick thought that this was a place of sanctuary, where the dignity and privacy of those going through treatment could be respected. However, treatment started in a set of porta cabins on the front lawn. The manor house itself gave all the hotel, spa-like feel, 3 meals a day. The patients were inpatients for 14 days. I always remember the vision in the morning going for breakfast, when all the ladies used to come down in their dressing gowns, float into the dining room, and join us, the staff, for our breakfasts. Treatments continued there, and the first 1,000 babies born from Bourn Hall were conceived in that window on the right-hand end. That was the embryology lab. All of this was happening while the new building was taking shape. There had always been plans to make a bricks and mortar thing. All was not to go as planned, however. Does anybody remember this quote from Michael Fish? You can see here, one of Bob's great passions are his trees. A massive plane tree, huge, and it was propped up by railway sleepers all the way around it. And the building work for the new block was just behind it. And it had got up to the second lift, which means the second floor. The roof hadn't gone on yet, when the hurricane that wasn't going to happen, happened. And it blew the plane tree and its magnificence into the building. And it wasn't insured. The building has been completed, you'll be glad to know. But this delay and Patrick's ill health and death in early '88 led to severe financial difficulties for Bourn Hall Clinic as a company. They were rescued later that year by Serono, a drug company which didn't want to see the very first IVF clinic in the world go under. It was a very bad day when Bob took me to one side, gave me a tin of warm beer, and said, "We're closing next month." That's how close it was. But we were rescued, and rescued by Sirona with a huge amount of inward investment and the remit to teach the world how to do high-quality IVF, which was great. But the new management also had a commercial eye, and Bob didn't really see eye to eye with them in terms of the further commercialization of the operation. So, despite all of the trees falling down, buildings falling in on Bob, he continued the work, and we all continued the work. He used to throw the pebble, and we'd go after it. That's the team he built around him. So here's a couple of things that did happen under his watch. Now, where do you think Louise Brown was conceived? She was conceived in a desiccator like that one, which had gas put in at the top and a little Petri dish. Petri dish baby doesn't make it into the newspapers. A Petri dish inside that. And what was that put into? Those of you who have worked in laboratories will know a drying oven. Anybody know a drying oven? It's basically an oven. And to keep it at 37 degrees, 37.5 degrees, is quite difficult. So that's how it started, and that's how we did the first few hundred cases, way before we got proper incubator ovens, moved out of the desiccator, where Louise was concerned, we had more than one, through the development of incubators, which were entirely enclosed, were coupled with AI and videography, and the future looks like that, which is a fully automated IVF laboratory. From sperm and eggs, everything is done by robots. It's coming. Not too soon, given the expense of it, but it is coming. So, Bourn Hall, 1985, saw the first birth of a frozen blastocyst baby, which was incredible, if you think about it. Shortly following the success in Australia with a cleavage stage embryo, Bourn Hall was the first to take a blastocyst, which is a partially differentiated structure, freeze it, thaw it successfully, and achieve a pregnancy. My friends, the gynecologists, started off at the top picture there. You can see Patrick Stepter with his laparoscope going in to harvest the eggs. In the 83-85 era, they discovered ultrasound, but they went through the abdomen. But eventually, the gynecologist found the vagina.
The male gynecologist, yes.
And by far the simpler and much easier process is what's common today, is vaginal ultrasound egg retrieval. So these were all happening while Bob was managing all of this societal hoo-ha, as well as buildings that were falling down. The panel on the right describes how we took control of women's cycles. Up until the time of 85, 86, we had to time egg collection to the woman's natural LH surge, which meant that these inpatient women had to give me, in the laboratory, a little bottle of urine every 3 hours, as well as collect the whole lot for 24 hours so I can measure the volume of it in order to predict where the LH surge was going to happen. Because the LH surge, 26 hours later, the eggs are ovulating. So you've got to go in. And that meant we were doing surgeries at all sorts of times of the day and night. And it's absolutely true. Women from other continents have a different biological clock when they came. So they were always the ones that were done at midnight, which was a shame. But with the evolution of these ways of stimulating, the whole thing changed from an inpatient therapy where I had to be monitoring them all the time to an outpatient treatment. And we lost something because we used to have 6 bedded wards, and the support group from the 6 women who shared maybe 10, 14 days together going through the same process was just brilliant. Now it's an outpatient therapy. You pop in, pop out, have your appointment. You hardly ever meet another patient. And Grace there will tell you how the patients used to have sing-songs in the lounge, how they used to be entertained by Bob and Patrick on occasion, because Patrick was a concert pianist after all. So, onwards. And I think this has already been mentioned. Bob's philosophy was entirely encapsulated here. Educate the patients, educate the IVF community in particular, and educate society on what he was doing. His ability to engage with anybody at any level in society was fantastic. I couldn't believe it. This is a man who, a polymath, could talk about the football results. And also in terms of publication. If you had done, made an observation, you have got to publish it because everybody needs to know about it. It will come as no surprise that Bob, being ahead of his time, also called the first international IVF Congress, and that was in 1981. That was a year after Bourn Hall was developed. Oh, God, right. Okay. So, also the publication, the training, we had many hundreds of doctors and scientists through Bourn Hall training programs. Unfortunately, Patrick didn't live to see get a knighthood or Bob receiving the Nobel Prize. One word about regulation. The Bourn Hall Ethics Committee was established in 1981. There was a vacuum in terms of places you could go to discuss reasonably what was happening in this newly emergent field. It had key members from both the laity and religious groups. Somebody's already mentioned Dame Mary Warnock, which led to the HFEA being formed after the Interim Licensing Authority. The Act is being updated again after the update in 2008, and I hope that a lot of the issues, the political issues, will be addressed in that. So thank you for your attention. Lastly, before I go,
Wow.
This is Louise's 21st birthday party. 25th birthday party. I didn't know you had so many friends. You can see Bob flanked.
There.
Right there. Sure. And I think I'd like to end by saying happy birthday, Bob, from the 13 million families that he has helped create. So happy birthday, Bob.
Thank you, Mike. And now over to Fiona.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion this evening to consider the life and legacy of Bob Edwards. I worked with him, or for and with him, for the last 20 years of his active career. And that was when he was in his publishing mode. So I only knew him in the publishing world. So that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. From 1990 to 2000, I was gradually getting more involved with the human reproduction journals, which has been mentioned, that these were formed by the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology. But from mid-1990s onwards, the World Wide Web was becoming a feature. And Bob used to, one of the high spots of his week was Friday lunchtime, when he would come to this college to have the famous fish and chips, when he would share conversation and discuss everything with his fellow members of the college. And of course, quite quickly, the World Wide Web was the first thing that he would be considering. And he realized very quickly that this was an opportunity to revolutionize scientific publishing, because it would provide the ability to make the results of research available as soon as they were accepted for publication, rather than wait several months sometimes, and even occasionally years, for them to appear in print. So colleagues in the field would be able to see the results of groundbreaking research very, very quickly. There were many doubters about the idea of presenting accepted papers online before print, but Bob was always adamant that although this publication was rapid, it would be responsible. So there was never any question that these papers would be not properly refereed. Well, I haven't started the slides, sorry. Here he is. I'm so sorry. Here he is. This is, actually, I've started at the end with this slide, because this is the 10th anniversary of the journal which he founded on the back of fish and chips lunch. And he founded this from a standing start, with no backing from a society. He was determined to do it. And I think it has been mentioned previously that, he was not one to accept a setback. If there was a setback, he would find a way around it. And indeed he did. He founded this journal basically on his own. He had a little bit of help. He had nine colleagues and friends who put up the seed capital to set up the business. He also had two willing lieutenants in the form of Caroline Blackwell, who is here tonight, and myself. The three of us started in a stable on his farm. In this stable, we had 3 desks, 3 computers, a printer, and a dedicated web server. This was in the year 2000. By June 2000, we were fully operational, and Bob, because he was 75 at this time, very few people would consider starting up something like this at the age of 75, but he had so much energy, he was undaunted. And so we started off, and he was in a hurry. So we wanted to get this was the cover of the first issue, which was supposed to be July, but actually it didn't come out till August. We were publishing bi-monthly, and by the end of 2000, we had published the first volume, and that was very important to Bob. We also set up our first website, and the ability to pay online for subscriptions. And if you could pay online, you could immediately access the journals and see the accepted papers published online rather than waiting for the print. We did actually produce the print version as well, because we didn't want to, get ahead of ourselves, but we produced print and web, and we provided various different forms of subscription. The web-only subscription was the cheapest, of course. Fast forward to 2004, We needed to get more staff. We were publishing totally in-house with a few freelances. All the production and publication was done from our little stable office. But by 2004, it was obvious we needed to have some more in-house staff, two of whom are here today, I believe. I've seen them in the audience, Maria and Catherine. Were recruited to help us in the office, and actually that's Catherine in the background there, in a converted barn on Bob and Ruth's stable, Bob and Ruth farm, sorry. Alongside this rapid expansion of the publishing scientific papers in his field, in his niche area, he also wanted to not lose focus of the moral dilemmas facing the field of reproductive medicine. So alongside this, he was organising the first international conference on ethics, science and moral philosophy. So we had a lot to cope with. There was a lot to do, but because of his infectious enthusiasm and unerring belief that, you know, it was possible, we could do it, no problem, we all of us pitched in and we did it. So here are a few of the milestones which punctuated our first 10 years. I won't go into them all. By 2004, we were publishing monthly. We'd done the move. By the end of 2005, despite repeated requests to the Thompson ISI people in Philadelphia to get an impact factor for the journal, because back then, 20 years ago, the impact factor was the gold standard by which a journal would be measured by authors wanting to submit, because the impact factor, put very, very simply, measured how often a journal's papers were cited in other journals. So it was the number of citations, and it was all important to establish this journal that it should get an impact factor. So in 2006, we visited, Bob and I and Caroline, we were in Philadelphia at the American Society's annual conference. And so in his inimitable fashion, Bob decided he was going to go and see the Thompson ISI people. So he and I jumped into a cab one morning, sped across town. He had already arranged to have a meeting with two of the senior people in the Thompson ISI office, both of whom were women. As soon as he walked in, they were gobsmacked. Here was the great Professor Edwards in their presence. This meeting actually turned out to be more of an interview from Bob to ISI. Well, let it be known that the following year we got our impact factor, only 9 months later. And we were celebrating it at the ESHRA of the European Society meeting in France the following June. And as you can see, Bob was delighted, as were Caroline and myself. It was a lot of hard work, but it was worth it. And we came in at 3.206, which in those days meant a lot. It was very high. I'm going to gloss over that bit. So finally, going, I've lost all my notes here. Thompson ISI, impact factor. So now by 2008, the publication it was really well established with its impact factor, but by 2008, Bob was sort of winding down. I was preparing to retire a couple of years later, and it was clear that we needed a publishing house to take over production and publication. After a lot of meetings, we've settled with the help of Kamal Ahuja, who was here earlier, I think. We managed to secure Elsevier to take the journal on under a 5-year publication contract, but the journal remained independent, and that was very important to Bob. He wanted to be independent of any publishing house so that he could publish what he wanted and not what they said he should publish. So it was still privately owned. And I do want my last slide will be the fourth member of our team, a covert member, but Ruth was always there in the background encouraging, and she was very kind because she had to put up with the three of us trotting backwards and forwards to the farmhouse in the first early years to use the loo. So I just want to close with a quotation. Bob was always principled in what his standards that he set for publishing scientific work, and he often quoted Isaac Newton. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, and I think many people here will be standing on his giant shoulders going forward. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fiona. Well, so many things come to mind there. I kind of feel that there's room for a Bob Edwards pub sort of tour somewhere in all this. Now, we've got time for a few more minutes of questions, but a very hard stop at 7:15. Anyone want to... Here we are, we've got a question over here.
Thanks. We've just heard that Bob in his mid-70s embraced the web. What would he have thought of end-to-end automated IVF done by robots?
Mike, do you want to handle that one?
He was a very skilled embryologist himself, despite having hands like hams. But I think he would probably welcome it because, as you're probably not aware, there is a dearth in terms of embryologists coming through the system. It was partly the blame of the NHS again, where they took the training of embryologists in the UK away from Alpha and put it into the NHS curriculum. So there's a paucity of actually really skilled embryologists. And some of the procedures are fairly agricultural, to put no too fine a point on it. Collecting the eggs, the harvesting of the eggs, well, the sperm, that's very agricultural. So I think he would embrace it, but it has to have a human somewhere controlling it and looking at the quality of the embryos. AI is beginning to do that job, but it's got a long way to go to beat any of our embryologists.
Actually, one thing I'd like to pick up on, Mike, is what do you think Bob would make of the success rate today? And also, Emma alluded to it, the dreaded add-ons, which can often be a bit of a con, let's face it.
I think he would have rejected most of the add-ons.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the other question was about...
Well, the success rate.
Oh, the success rates.
So because it's still below 50-50, isn't it?
When Bourn Hall started, we were lucky if we got that dreadful phrase, take-home baby rate, of around about 12 to 15% on a good day. Now, with the advances that some of which I've talked about, we're looking at, if you get a blastocyst back, 50 to 60% take-home.
Okay. And the add-ons are just ways that people claim that you can pick healthier embryos.
Well, no, some of the add-ons are
things.
clinical and to do with immunology, which is unproven, to do with genetic testing, which is unproven too. Yeah. So I think he would have been skeptical, but he would have appreciated the endeavour. Part of the problem with I believe it's the most highly regulated field of medicine, is it stifles innovation. And some of these add-ons have been, if you like, experiments which have never had enough power to be persuasive. So I'd be very skeptical, and I think Bob would be.
Let's have
Can I just make one comment to that question about whether he would embrace new technology? It was a family joke that he was setting up the first online journal because at home he couldn't work his computer.
Oh, we're getting the best gossip now. Yeah. There are more hands coming. We probably got time for it. Be really brief. 2, maybe 3 questions. So fire away.
We've heard about the somewhat hostile reaction after 1978, so that raises a question. Were there ethical review procedures in the mid-70s? Did Bob have to deal with these? Because for those of you not in universities, ethical review procedures can be quite a challenge these days, and particularly for more pioneering or unconventional treatments. So was this an issue back in the mid-70s?
No, it wasn't. That's why Bob set up the first bioethics committee himself, because there was a lack of institutional engagement with reproductive medicine and the issues surrounding it.
So, Richard, did you feel unrestrained by ethics?
No, I think Bob had got the balance absolutely right at that time. But I mean, one of the issues that still came up, I was on an HFEA committee a few years ago, and one of the host people was agonizing about whether IVF babies should be told about their origin. They might be traumatized, and if so, at what age? So I had to recount the following. That we had a son, courtesy of Bob and Patrick, and when he was 5 years old, we took him back to Bourn Hall for a party, and Bob, as a dutiful godparent, showed him round. We got in the car to return to Oxford, and he was sitting in the back, and he suddenly piped up and said, "I know how I got there. How does it happen normally?" And my wife gave him a very anodyne, extremely cosmetic account that failed to satisfy. So she tried again, and it didn't do much better. So in the end, she decided she had no choice but to give him the full Monty, devoid of jargon. There was a brief, complete silence in the back of the car, then a loud chuckle, and he said, "That's disgusting."
Right, we've got time for maybe one quick list. There's one here and one here, but be super quick.
I don't have a question really, but all I'd like to say is thank you very, very much to all you lovely people. Many of you are doing work in this area of IVF, genetics, embryology, and all of that. Because of your work, your contributions, people like myself have been able to be parents today. I'm an IVF parent myself. This young lady here is 16, and she's my own IVF baby. She has a twin brother who's at home right now. But she and her brother were 8 cells each as little embryos when they were transferred back to my belly. So I personally have gained a lot from all of your great work and all your efforts. So thank you very, very much. It has been a lovely evening. And I'm so glad I could be here and listen to all your fascinating stories about everything that you guys have been doing here. So thank you.
Do you know, I think I think that is a great place to finish, actually. I wanted just to, again... there's one more person. Sorry, there's a colleague of Bob's who... Let's give just the last word to Bob, actually.
My name's John Slee. I first met Bob in October 1948 at a lecture in agricultural chemistry at Bangor University. And I just found myself sitting next to this man with a right northern accent and jet black hair, and we became close friends for the next 10 years. And it was a wonderful friendship for me and a marvellous time. And Bob managed to convert me from being the bluest of blue Tories into a left-wing socialist within 1 week.
There's no limit to this man's talents, actually. I think we'll have to end it there. I'm so sorry that we could go on all night long. Thanks to the Churchill Archive Centre, to the Loke Centre for Trophoblast Research, the Cambridge Reproduction folk. Grateful to Madeline Evans, to Churchill's archivists, and of course the Edwards family. There will be drinks in the buttery. Thank you for those brilliant questions. And last but not least, do give one last round of applause to our brilliant panel. Thank you.